Hello, I'm Adinser and this is my Restore Druid guide for patch 6.2. The Mighty Druid has always been my favorite class and still is to this day. Over the years I have leveled around 20 to 30 druids and I will eventually level one again. I absolutely love the class, although as everything in Warlords of Draenor it did suffer a downgrade when it comes to fun. Sadly, Symbiosis is no more. I miss that spell most of all after the ability pruning, but the druid, especially Resto, is still a good option when choosing an alt or even a new main. The spec has a rich history and the flavor to carry it even in its darkest times. However, it barely has a place in a well-balanced raiding group. In terms of utility, burst and sustained healing, it cannot be compared to a Resto Shaman. And Disco Priests and Holy Pallies are better to have in a raid, generally. So it comes down to what you pick after you have the Shaman, Disco and Pally. Do you take a Mistweaver, Holy Priest or a Restore Druid? They fill a similar role in a raid. And the funniest thing is that I had the most fun when playing with those three specs. It's a darn shame. Though that's only for mythic progression. You can have like 3 Restore Druids in a normal or heroic raid and clear it just fine, as long as they know what they're doing. And that is what this guide is for, teaching new players how to use the Restore Druid to its fullest potential. So as always, I'll quickly go through our healing spells and after that see how they form our core gameplay in a raiding environment. Now, the Restore Druid is a heal over time based class and our most powerful spell is Rejuvenation. It is a really cheap insta-cast hot that can be cast twice on a target with the default talent in the level 100 tier, Germination, so it is great for tank healing, though its true strength comes from its interaction with Swift Mend. And Swift Mend is an insta-cast heal that can only be cast on a target that has Rejuvenation on them. The actual healing it does isn't strong, but it procs Soul of the Forest, and more on that later, it's really important. A Regrowth is our fast and strong heal, though it's not so inefficient as with other healers. It always crits with the glyph of Regrowth, that is pretty much mandatory, and that is important because of a passive we have called Living Seed. Basically, whenever you crit with a spell, you put a seed on your target which will heal them when they take damage, for a percentage of the earlier crit heal. Healing Touch is our basic low-cost heal. Life Bloom is a really strong hot, but can be placed on only one target, generally on the tanks or players that have a dangerous dot on them. And Life Bloom interacts with Healing Touch after you get the Draenor perk that increases the crit chance of Healing Touch on targets that have Life Bloom. And that is kinda useful. A Wild Mushroom can be placed on the ground to constantly do tick healing in a 10-yard radius. It expires after 30 seconds but has no cooldown, so you can reposition it whenever you want, though be careful when doing so since it has a high mana cost. And remember to cast it frequently, ideally as soon as it expires. It does a lot of healing over time and is best to be cast on the melee group or a stacked ranged group. The heal that will do most of your healing in all fights is Wild Growth. As of the launch of Warlords, it has a cast time and a high mana cost, though with the glyph of Wild Growth that increases the number of targets affected by 1, it does a huge amount of healing. Most often it is the top healing spell on your healing counter and most of the time it's above 30% of your overall healing done. We have another form of burst AoE healing with the spell Genesis, but it requires a lot, and I do mean a lot, of time and mana to set up correctly, and it isn't useful as it once was. So what it does is it finishes all the ticks left from Rejuvenation on all targets affected by it, over the course of 2 seconds, and it counts for Germination as well. so it is really powerful. However, it isn't meant to be used on a huge scale. You can put rejuvenation on 8 people, not counting germination, so just at the base hot, and then use Genesis in order for it to heal up those targets fast. Since rejuvenation only lasts 18 seconds and with a global cooldown on it, by the time you hot 8 people with it, the first one will have 10 seconds left on his rejuvenation. So the more you continue to hot other people, or the more you wait, the weaker Genesis gets. It is a very tricky spell to use. Ideally, you could use it effectively by pre-hotting half the raid before a major raid-wide AoE damage ability, and then use Genesis in combination with Wild Growth to do massive AoE healing. Next is a spell to help us with a bit of mana conservation and at the same time do strong instant healing is Nature's Swiftness, or NS. When cast, the next healing touch, Regrowth, Entangling Roots or Rebirth will be free and insta-casts, and the heals, Healing Touch and Regrowth, will heal for 100% more. Next we have a strong buff that has a large cooldown of 6 minutes called Hearth of the Wild. Lastly, Tranquility alongside with Wild Growth and Rejuvenation. It does the most healing and is the most important and iconic spell of the Druid. However, it doesn't have the hot side to it anymore. Every time you healed with it, it stacked hot on everyone it healed, so it was a unique spell. Now it's similar to Holy Priest's Hymn of Hope, but with Heart of the Wild it still does insane amounts of HPS. It is a channeled abilities and it heals everyone in the raid in 40 yards of the caster. Let's get into some tricky stuff now. More than 70% of druids use Incarnation instead of Soul of the Forest talent, and for the life of me I can't figure out why. People use it for progression in all 3 difficulty levels and even on farm. In my experience and of what I have heard the top druids say, Incarnation is only good when you are struggling with mana, and even then most of the time Soul of the Forest is better. Plus you only need a couple of items to not worry about your mana at all. So let me explain how it works and why it's better. As I said before, it procs when you use Swift Mend, so in a best case scenario every 15 seconds. When you have the proc, your next healing touch has its cast time reduced by half, and that's a minor thing. Or if you cast Rejuvenation or Regrowth, they do double the healing. You use Soul of the Forest on those 2 spells sometimes. And lastly, and most importantly, it increases the healing of the next Wild Growth by 50%. And most of the time you use Soul of the Forest for Wild Growth. So in essence, the talent is a passive buff to your healing through the entire fight, and a great one at that. While the tree is a cooldown that you can use 2 or sometimes 3 times in a fight, and to be effective you have to use Tranquility in combination with it. So Soul does a lot more consistent and burst healing, while you have your chunk saved for a more difficult part of the fight. Ultimately though, it comes down to personal preference. If you don't care about having the optimal build, the place tires of Incarnation and Soul are different enough to set aside what is optimal. With Tree, you get the more powerful Wild Growth because it targets 2 additional people, and while in Tree you get a 15% increase in all healing done. So you should use Tree when the raid most needs it. In parts of the fight when there is a lot of AoE damage, or you need to pick up the pace because other healers are dead or just slacking. And generally you use Tranquility with Tree as well because of the 15% healing increase. With Soul you get a balance in your quote-unquote rotation, and your spells get more interaction. Usually, as I said, you use it for Wild Growth, though when it isn't needed and you know that you won't need it in the next 10 to 15 seconds, it is better to still use Swiftmend on cooldown to gain the buff and save it until just before the next Swiftmend. So that way you can use 2 consecutive strong wild growths. If you don't need 2 of them though, you can use the proc on a rejuvenation or even a regrowth, especially if you have a free regrowth. So as I said, it comes down to personal preference. Do you want a cooldown and lower HPS over the course of the fight, but more healing on burst phases, or do you want a well-rounded passive that changes the way you play and gives you more choices and makes you make decisions? So I mentioned a free regrowth. That comes from one of our passives, and we have a number of important ones to keep track of. We have Living Seed, which I mentioned before. Omen of Clarity gives our Life Bloom ticks a chance to make the next regrowth we cast free. And the most important one is our Mastery. The non-interactive side of our Mastery makes our direct heals stronger, and the interactive one makes our HOTS stronger by the same amount after we use a direct heal. The buff lasts 20 seconds and is called Harmony. I strongly recommend that you track this buff with an add-on such as Weak Auras. You simply can't let it fall off in a fight, unless there is no damage coming in and you don't have HOTS on anyone, so you won't get a benefit. Before we go to an actual fight, let's see our utility and personal cooldown spells. First of all, as a druid we have 3 forms that can help out in different situations. Well, 2 in PvE to be exact. As for bear form, I personally don't use it often, though it is great for soaking damage on its own, and especially when combined with Bark Skin. And Bark Skin is our major and only personal defensive cooldown, that we can only cast on ourselves. It decreases the damage we take by 20%. Second is our cat form, of course, and it increases our movement speed by 30%. Really, the druid is unparalleled when it comes to movement. We have a spell that counts as a blink and a sprint combined, Displacer Beast. We have a traditional sprint in dash, and on top of that we have an AoE sprint. And I can't stress this enough. Use Stampeding Roar whenever you can. It is the only AoE speed boost in the game as far as I know, and it helps out in every single raid, so get used to using it. Then there are a plethora of CC abilities, Cyclone as the hardest short CC in the game, Entangling Roots for obviously rooting, Fairy Swarm to slow, Ursol's Vortex to pin adds down, and you can always switch things around because 2 out of our talent tree tiers are CC based. Our DPS abilities, Moonfire and Wrath, are really weak, as a healer's DPS abilities should be. Paladins. Excuse me. Though with Heart of the Wild they do decent damage and can prove to be good for clearing ads if you crit, I guess. Lastly, there is Revive, our Resurrect, Cleanse our Dispel, Soothe, our Purge, though only usable on Enrage effects, Mark of the Wild, our only buff, and Rebirth is our Combat Resurrect, for which druids are famous for. With the Draenor perk it is an instant cast now. So let's get into a raid encounter and see how things play out. I am going back to the format I used for my first guide, which was for the Brewmaster Monk, and go through 1 or 2 fights and point out what I was doing, what I was thinking, if I can remember, and most importantly where I made mistakes. Because learning from your own and the mistakes of others is one of the best ways to get better. So let's get right into it. So right before the fight starts I'm hotting up the main tank, in this case the Paladin, and as soon as he pulls I'm proccing Harmony with Swiftmend, and the Mushroom goes on the melee group as well, since they're the only ones taking any damage at the moment. So I can proceed to DPS on the boss, and when that comes, CCing him. First with Entangling Roots, then slowing him with Fairy Fire. Or in this case Fairy Swarm, which is great for this fight. And an even better talent is Ursol's Vortex. Not only does it slow ads, it knocks them back. So the first Heartseeker goes on the mage, and I put all 3 hots on him, even though mages have a lot of personal defensive cooldowns. They can survive stuff like that easily, but the dot from Heartseeker, when combined with the swirly yellow-green thingies, can insta-kill him, and if he doesn't have heal or hot or cooldown, he's dead, so that's why I do that. And the hunter goes really far away, so I need to wait for him to come back in order to pot him up. And since there isn't much AoE damage going on, I use strong hots on them as well, buffed with Soul of the Forest. A Heartseeker is on me now, and I can just throw out a few heals before I go, since I have Displacer Beast, so it takes no time to get to the entrance. And there's my first mistake. I didn't... whoa, second mistake. First is I didn't use my defensive cooldowns when I should have. I used them later to mitigate the debuff damage, not the initial damage. And I didn't use a cooldown when the raid needed me to do so. The other healer was in visions, so I needed to use something. I used Heart of the Wild, but too late. Now it's only useful for DPSing the ads and the boss a little, and healing up the raid. So, if you noticed, every single swirly phase, death throws, if you want to call it like that, I tried to use buffed wild growth with Soul of the Forest. And there are 2 reasons for that. First is the entire raid is on the move to avoid stuff like that, and we need a small cooldown like Soul of the Forest to survive. And the second and more important reason is that in every single raid ever, so in Mythic Progression top tier raids, it's always best to assume that people will fuck up and they will get hit by stuff they shouldn't have hit, so proactively healing them with a small cooldown like that can save lives. And the only way to save everyone from dying is to predict that they will fuck up, so that's why I do that. And that's the gist of this fight at least. Keep CCing and DPSing while the other healers have the buff, and help out with healing when they are in visions. Even with that said though, my healing was close to theirs. Anyway, the most important thing in any fight is knowing when to use Wild Growth and Tranquility. Admittedly, I didn't use Trank this fight at all. I thought of that as a mistake until I saw this. And it was apparent that the group outgeared this fight, and there was no need for a Trank, plus only a handful of people made mistakes and there was no missed interrupt, so that directly affects my decisions as a healer. 2 ads spawn in the back, and I use Ursol's Vortex to pin one down and root the other one, so the DPS can clear them up easily. And it's getting hectic again, and again I don't know why I'm not using Tranquility, although, well, I do know. The raid isn't stacked that much and only a few people got really low. The rest of the raid was fine, so yeah, just needed to use some single target cooldowns. And I used it on the tank. I used Iron Bark the first time this fight actually, and I don't remember the last time I used it on anyone else than a tank, at least in this raid. So yeah, the mage gets Heartseeker again, unlucky bastard, and I hot him up again. Visions of Death are up, although people shouldn't be getting into them. The boss is on 5 HP. I continue to help with the ads, although it's not needed anymore. But as you have seen, like 28k unbuffed Wrath crit, so that's not bad actually. The reason for picking this fight is quite simple. I wanted to show off the Druid's versatility and adaptability. And even though hybrids in general aren't what they used to be, we all get an opportunity once in a while to be in a supporting role in a raid. In this fight we saw our DPS, CC and healing capabilities. You simply can't ask for a better fight to show off a class. Anyway, those are the basics of the Restoration Druid, and I really hope that you found this useful. If you want to go into a more in-depth discussion of talents, glyphs, macros and stuff like that, click on the annotation on the screen to go to the second part of this guide. Thanks for watching and see you next time.